Hello, dreamers! Today we're going to explore one of the most fascinating chapters conveniently left out of school textbooks. How ancient Egypt became the world's first pharmacological superpower. A civilization that built eternal monuments while experimenting with substances that would make a modern electronic music festival look like a Boy Scout meeting. Before we begin this journey through the hallucinogenic sands of time, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. But only if you really enjoy this kind of content that history teachers pretend doesn't exist. And tell me in the comments the strangest substance you've ever seen someone use for medicinal purposes. The answers always surprise me. Now relax, dim the lights, get comfortable in bed, because this is the perfect bedtime story. We're about to discover how one of the greatest civilizations in human history was built by people who knew exactly where to find the best psychoactive plants in the Nile Valley. But let's make one thing very clear first. This is not a tutorial on how to recreate ancient recipes. This is pure history. Egyptians regularly died of overdoses, accidental poisonings, and an impressive variety of side effects they discovered the hard way. Forget everything you think you know about the ancient Egyptians. Yes, they were masters of architecture, mathematics, and astronomy. But they were also top-notch experimental chemists, diploma-less pharmacologists, and occasionally a little too hooked on their own discoveries. Ancient Egypt wasn't just a land of pharaohs and pyramids. It was a vast natural laboratory where, for more than 3,000 years, very clever people systematically tested which plant made you see gods, which root eased the chronic pain of hauling stone blocks, and which fungus was perfect for those long religious ceremonies when you had to pretend you were hearing divine messages. And here's the part no one tells you. They documented everything, in medical papyri, in tomb paintings, in recipes carved into temple walls. The Egyptians were the first to create something like a pharmacological manual, only much more interesting and definitely more dangerous. Let's be honest here. When you're living in a time when life expectancy hovers around 35, where water can kill you faster than a crocodile, and when peak entertainment is watching someone get mummified, you naturally get creative in finding ways to make existence more bearable. The result was a natural pharmacy that ranged from mild sedatives to potent hallucinogens, including painkillers that would make today's pharmaceutical industry drool with envy, and all of it wrapped up in a religious culture that considered altered states of consciousness not just acceptable but essential for communication with the divine. What makes this story fascinating isn't romanticizing substance use, but understanding how an entire civilization integrated experimental pharmacology into every aspect of life. Medicine, religion, work, leisure, even preparation for death. It was a holistic approach that would make a modern integrative medicine practitioner weep with admiration, or with horror. On our journey, we'll explore how the Egyptians discovered, refined and systematized the use of dozens of psychoactive substances. We'll get to know the medical papyri, which read like recipes from a secret laboratory, the temples that functioned as pharmaceutical distribution centers, and the pharaohs who ruled entire empires while being, let's say, chemically assisted. We'll uncover how pyramid construction may have been financed by the drug trade, how priests used hallucinogens to talk with the gods, and how mummification became a way to preserve not only bodies, but also personal stashes of substances for the afterlife. Ready to find out why hieroglyphs sometimes look like they were written by someone who had just sampled a very interesting plant. Why tomb paintings include scenes that only really make sense under the influence of certain substances. And why the ancient Egyptians had an obsession with plants that coincidentally alter your perception of reality. This is the untold story of how Egypt became the world's first pharmacological civilization. And trust me, it's way more interesting than any documentary you've ever seen on the Discovery Channel. Picture the scene. You're a scribe in ancient Egypt, 1600 BC. Your job is to record medical treatments for future generations. You pick up your reed pen, prepare your ink, and start writing something like, "For severe headache, mix opium with wine, add a bit of cannabis, season with mandrake, and pray the patient wakes up the next morning." If that sounds more like a recipe for a hallucinogenic cocktail than a medical treatment, welcome to the pharmacological papyri of ancient Egypt, where the line between medicine and recreation was basically a matter of dosage and good luck. Egyptian medical papyri are some of the most fascinating and terrifying documents in the history of medicine, not because they were primitive, but because they were surprisingly advanced in areas they probably shouldn't have been. They knew exactly which plants caused which effects, which combinations were lethal, and which dosages sent you straight into an intimate conversation with Anubis. Let's start with the Edwin Smith Papyrus, discovered in the 19th century and dating to around 1600 BC. This document is considered the world's first neurosurgical treatise, and when we say neurosurgery, we're talking about brain procedures performed with bronze tools and the most creative anesthesia you can imagine. The papyrus describes 48 different surgical cases, from head wounds to spinal injuries, and for each painful procedure there's an anesthetic recipe that would make a modern anesthesiologist break into a cold sweat. Opium mixed with fermented beer, cannabis in oil for topical application, mandrake in wine for the more serious cases. The most impressive thing is that they knew different injuries required different levels of sedation. Superficial scalp wound, a light dose of blue lotus and beer. Full cranial trepanation, then, my friend, it was heavy opium backed up with mandrake. And everyone just hoped the patient wouldn't wake up halfway through. But here's the macabre detail. The papyrus also meticulously recorded when treatments went wrong. And they went wrong at an alarming rate. Opium overdose during brain surgery seems to have been such a common cause of death that it deserved its own record category. Next, we have the Ebers Papyrus from 1550 BC, essentially the world's first complete pharmacy. More than 700 medical prescriptions, and at least 200 of them contain substances we'd now classify as controlled drugs. The Ebers Papyrus doesn't mess around. It lists treatments for everything from constipation to depression, and the solution to almost every ailment involved some plant with psychoactive properties. Digestive problems, cannabis in honey, insomnia, opium with milk, anxiety, fermented blue lotus, chronic pain, a mix of all of the above, fondly called the medicine of the gods. One of the most detailed recipes is for what they called the sickness of the sad spirits, which any modern psychiatrist would immediately recognize as depression. The treatment involved a complex mix of blue lotus, small amounts of opium, aromatic herbs and honey, all fermented for 7 days and taken during the new moon. What's interesting is that the recipe includes detailed dosage instructions based on body weight and patient age. This wasn't primitive medicine. It was personalized pharmacology with ingredients that would give Walter White nightmares. The papyrus also contains an entire section dedicated to what they called women's medicine, and here things get particularly interesting, because the ancient Egyptians apparently discovered that cannabis had specific properties for relieving menstrual pain and easing childbirth. They developed suppositories made of cannabis mixed with honey and other herbs, inserted vaginally for pain relief, which means Egyptian women may have had access to effective gynecological painkillers more than 3,000 years ago. Meanwhile, in many parts of the world, those same pains are still treated with chamomile tea and the suggestion that it's normal to suffer. But the Ebers Papyrus also reveals the dark side of this advanced pharmacology. There are specific recipes to induce abortions involving dangerous dosages of toxic substances, tansy, pennyroyal, and other herbs that worked, but also killed women at an alarming rate. The document carefully records the signs of poisoning for each substance, almost as if Egyptian doctors were conducting involuntary clinical trials on the population. Patient has seizures after mandrake. Write it down. Opium causes respiratory arrest at high doses. Valuable info for next time. Then comes the London Papyrus, from 1300 BC, where things get really interesting from a pharmacological standpoint. This document focuses specifically on psychoactive substances and their effects on what they called the Kai, or soul. The London Papyrus contains the earliest detailed descriptions of hallucinogenic plant-induced experiences. They describe specific visions caused by different substances, from conversations with gods to journeys into the underworld. And the most striking part is that they categorize these experiences as medicinal. According to the papyrus, certain visions were considered diagnostic. If you took a specific mixture of blue lotus and mandrake and saw Isis crying, it meant your illness was caused by repressed sadness. If you saw Thoth writing, the problem was mental and required different treatments. It was a primitive form of psychedelic-assisted therapy. The document also includes the first known description of what was clearly a bad trip. A patient who overdosed on mandrake reported seeing demons devouring his heart, while snakes crawled out of his ears. The medical solution: give him more opium until the visions became less terrifying. What makes these papyri truly extraordinary is the methodology. Egyptian doctors weren't just randomly experimenting with plants. They developed systematic protocols to test new substances, document side effects, and adjust dosages. They essentially had clinical trials. New drugs were first tested on prisoners condemned to death. If the prisoner survived and showed improvement in the treated condition, the substance was considered safe for free patients. If he died, well, he was already condemned, and at least he contributed to science. This approach resulted in an impressively sophisticated pharmacology. The papyri describe specific drug interactions. Opium shouldn't be mixed with mandrake unless the patient is very young and healthy. Cannabis dangerously amplifies the effects of alcohol. Blue lotus can cause heart problems in the elderly if combined with certain stimulating herbs. They also developed specific antidotes for overdoses. Mandrake poisoning was treated with fresh milk and activated charcoal. Opium overdose required induced vomiting followed by plant-based stimulants. Cannabis intoxication was treated with cold baths and bitter herbs that neutralized THC. The papyri also reveal that Egyptian doctors understood concepts rediscovered only millennia later. They knew psychological context affected the efficacy of psychoactive drugs. Anxious patients needed calm environments and soft music during treatment. Depressed patients responded better when surrounded by family in familiar settings. They developed what was essentially set-and-setting therapy 3,000 years before Timothy Leary coined the term. The environment, the patient's mindset, and the presence of trusted people were considered as important as the drug itself. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of these documents is their brutal honesty about failures and deaths. The papyri don't try to hide when treatments went wrong. They record fatal overdoses, deadly allergic reactions, and cases where patients developed chemical dependency. One particularly grim entry in the Ebers Papyrus describes a royal scribe who became addicted to opium after treatment for back pain. The document details his physical and mental decline over months, including how he stole opium from temple stores and eventually died of overdose. The entry ends with a cold clinical note. Opium relieves pain, but can destroy the man. The papyri also contains some of the earliest descriptions of withdrawal syndrome. Patients who abruptly stopped taking opium after prolonged use developed tremors, sweats, vomiting, and what they described as the terror of spirits. The treatment was gradual dose reduction, mixed with calming herbs. What emerges from these documents is the portrait of a civilization that embraced experimental pharmacology with remarkable sophistication, but also with a sober understanding of the risks involved. They didn't romanticize psychoactive substances. They saw them as powerful tools that could heal or kill, depending on how they were used. The medical papyri of ancient Egypt are, essentially, the first harm reduction manuals in history. They taught how to use dangerous substances as safely as possible, how to recognize warning signs, and how to intervene when things went out of control. And here's the historical irony. A civilization 3,000 years ago had a more nuanced and scientific approach to psychoactive substances than many modern societies. They combined rigorous scientific curiosity with practical safety measures, resulting in a pharmacology that was both innovative and responsible. When you read these papyri today, one thing becomes clear. The ancient Egyptians weren't reckless stoners messing around with plants. They were meticulous scientists who understood they were dealing with powerful forces that demanded respect, knowledge, and extreme caution. And with this solid base of documented knowledge, they moved on to explore specific substances with a depth that still impresses modern researchers. If you've ever visited a museum with Egyptian art, you've probably noticed something strange. Everyone is holding flowers. Pharaohs sniffing petals, nobles offering bouquets, banquet guests passing flowers around as if they were hors d'oeuvres. And always the same flower, a beautiful blue blossom with delicate petals that seems to have been the must-have accessory at any social event in ancient Egypt. Well, it wasn't just decoration. It was Nymphaea Cerulea, the blue lotus, and it appeared in every tomb, every party, and every temple for one very specific reason. It made you feel good, really good, in a way that helped explain why Egyptians thought of the afterlife as a continuation of the party. The blue lotus wasn't technically a lotus, but a water lily that grew abundantly along the Nile. And the Egyptians quickly discovered that when you dried its petals, fermented them with wine, or simply inhaled its fragrance deeply, interesting things happened to your mood. We're not talking about heavy hallucinations or psychedelic trips. The blue lotus was more subtle than that. It was like a natural antidepressant that also worked as a mild anxiolytic. It made you relaxed, a little euphoric, and gave you a general feeling that maybe hauling giant stones through the desert wasn't so bad after all. The secret lay in the plant's chemical compounds: nuciferine, aporphine, and other alkaloids that affected the central nervous system in surprisingly specific ways. Nuciferine, for example, had sedative and antispasmodic properties. Aporphine worked as a natural muscle relaxant. Together, they produced an effect anyone today would recognize as an effective anti-anxiety remedy. But the Egyptians didn't know molecular chemistry. They just knew the flour made them feel better, and they developed elaborate methods to enhance its effects. The most popular method was alcoholic fermentation. Dried blue lotus petals were steeped in wine for days or weeks, creating a drink that combined the relaxing effects of alcohol with the plant's psychoactive properties. The result was a beverage the Egyptians called the wine of the gods, and it was consumed at practically every social occasion. Weddings, funerals, religious festivals, political meetings. If there was a reason to gather, there was blue lotus wine being poured. They also developed other methods of consumption. Blue lotus oil was used in massages that supposedly eased both physical pain and mental distress. The petals were burned as incense, producing an aromatic smoke inhaled during ceremonies. And some texts suggest they were simply chewed fresh, though apparently that tasted awful. What's most interesting is how the flower became integrated into Egyptian mythology and religion. The blue lotus was associated with the sun god Ra and with the concept of rebirth. The flower closes its petals at night and reopens them at dawn, which Egyptians interpreted as a symbol of the sun's daily death and resurrection. But there was likely a more practical reason for this symbolic association. If you consumed blue lotus regularly, especially in fermented form, you literally felt reborn every morning. The flower had properties that improved sleep quality and reduced nightmares, meaning people woke up rested and in a better mood. This didn't escape the notice of Egyptian priests, who quickly incorporated the blue lotus into religious rituals. Temples cultivated vast gardens of the plant, and priests developed specific recipes for different types of ceremonies. Healing rituals used mild preparations that simply relaxed participants. Ceremonies meant to communicate with the gods used stronger doses that induced deep meditative states. The blue lotus also became central to funerary rituals, not only because it symbolized rebirth, but because its sedative properties helped mourners cope with grief. Bereaved families received specific preparations of lotus to ease the anxiety and depression associated with loss. Mummies were often buried with bouquets of blue lotus, and not just for symbolic reasons. Egyptians believed the flower would continue to provide its benefits in the afterlife. It was like insurance against post-mortem depression, but perhaps the most interesting use of the blue lotus was in what Egyptians called the medicine of emotions. They had identified different types of sadness and anxiety and developed specific lotus preparations for each. Grief from loss was treated with blue lotus mixed with honey and aromatic herbs. Work-related anxiety was relieved with lotus tea taken in the morning. Insomnia, caused by worry, was fought with lotus oils applied to the temples before sleep. What's impressive is that these applications make sense from the perspective of modern pharmacology. The active compounds in blue lotus really do have mild anti-anxiety and antidepressant effects. The Egyptians had essentially developed a rudimentary psychiatric pharmacotherapy based on a single plant. The flower also had more down-to-earth uses, but no less important. Laborers performing physically exhausting tasks received rations of blue lotus to deal with stress and pain. Soldiers consumed lotus preparations before battles to reduce anxiety. Women in childbirth were given blue lotus for pain relief and relaxation. But like any psychoactive substance, blue lotus carried risks. While relatively safe compared to opium or mandrake, excessive use could cause problems. Medical texts describe symptoms of chronic use, including lethargy, loss of appetite, and what they called the disease of perpetual happiness. That disease of perpetual happiness was essentially what we'd recognize today as psychological dependence. People who used Blue Lotus daily for long periods became unable to handle stress or negative emotions without it. They were functionally dependent on its mood-stabilizing effect. The treatment for this condition was interesting. Instead of abruptly stopping lotus use, Egyptian doctors recommended gradual reduction, combined with physical exercise, sun exposure, and participation in community activities. It was essentially a primitive rehabilitation program focused on restoring the body's natural ability to generate well-being. The popularity of Blue Lotus also created the first agricultural economy based on a psychoactive substance. Specialized farmers cultivated the plant in artificial ponds along the Nile. There were specific quality standards for different varieties. Blue Lotus from certain regions was considered superior and fetched higher prices in the markets. Trade in Blue Lotus extended beyond Egypt. Merchants exported the dried flower to other Mediterranean and Middle Eastern civilizations. Later Greek texts mention Egyptian lotus as a valuable commodity, though many Greeks apparently didn't understand its psychoactive effects and used it only as an expensive perfume. The flower also influenced Egyptian art and literature in subtle but pervasive ways. Poems about Blue Lotus often contained metaphors that only make sense if you understand the plant's effects. Tomb paintings depict banquets where guests hold lotus flowers with serene, content expressions that suggest more than mere aesthetic appreciation. One of the most famous paintings, found in the tomb of Nebamun, shows a feast where practically every participant is holding Blue Lotus in specific ways. Some smell the flowers, others hold them to their chest, and some are apparently eating them. The whole scene has a dreamlike quality that makes much more sense if you assume the participants were under the flower's gentle influence. The Blue Lotus also appears in intriguing sexual contexts. Egyptian erotic texts often mention the flower as an aphrodisiac, and there's evidence it was used to reduce sexual inhibitions. Newlyweds received special preparations of Blue Lotus said to enhance both pleasure and emotional connection. This wasn't purely superstitious. The relaxing, disinhibiting effects of Blue Lotus could indeed work as a mild aphrodisiac, especially in a culture where sexual anxiety and tension were common, due to arranged marriages and strict social expectations. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the Blue Lotus was its role in Egypt's early experiments with democracy. Yes, democracy. While Egypt was outwardly an authoritarian theocracy, there's evidence that certain community decisions were made in local assemblies, where Blue Lotus was served to reduce tensions and foster consensus. These assemblies, called Blue Flower Councils, were meetings where local issues like water distribution, dispute resolution, and agricultural planning were discussed. Participants drank lotus tea before debates, which apparently reduced conflict and made people more willing to compromise. It was a primitive form of chemical diplomacy. When everyone is slightly relaxed and in a good mood, it's easier to reach mutual agreements. The Blue Lotus acted as a social lubricant that facilitated community cooperation. The decline of Blue Lotus use in Egypt coincided with political and religious changes. When Egypt was conquered by Persians, Greeks, and later Romans, new authorities often viewed widespread use of psychoactive substances with suspicion. Blue Lotus was gradually relegated to purely decorative or limited medicinal uses. Later, Christianity was particularly hostile to the Blue Lotus due to its associations with pagan rituals and altered consciousness. The flower was progressively removed from temple gardens, and its commercial cultivation declined. By the 4th century AD, detailed knowledge of its preparation and use had largely been lost. But traces of blue lotus survived in Egyptian folk medicine for centuries. Rural healers continued to use it for anxiety and insomnia, though often without fully understanding its mechanisms. Even today, some herbalists in modern Egypt still cultivate and use blue lotus, though mainly for tourists curious about traditional medicine. The modern rediscovery of the blue lotus began in the 19th century when archaeologists found large amounts of the flower preserved in Egyptian tombs. At first, researchers assumed it was purely decorative. Only when modern chemical analysis identified its psychoactive compounds did the flower's true importance become clear. Today, blue lotus is experiencing a revival among people interested in ethnobotany and natural medicine. While its effects are far milder than modern drugs, the flower offers a fascinating example of how a psychoactive substance can be integrated functionally and relatively safely into a society. The legacy of blue lotus in ancient Egypt teaches us some important lessons about psychoactive substances. First, that mild effects can be as socially valuable as strong ones. Second, that cultural integration matters more than chemical potency. And third, that social context determines whether a substance is beneficial or problematic. The Egyptians turned a common aquatic flower into a pillar of their civilization, not through reckless or hedonistic use, but through careful, contextualized and socially integrated application. It was pharmacology as social art, and it worked for over 2,000 years. And with this solid foundation of responsible use of mild substances, the Egyptians were ready to explore much more dangerous and powerful pharmacological territories. If the blue lotus was Egypt's national antidepressant, opium was its nuclear painkiller, a substance so powerful that a single poppy seed could mean the difference between surviving a primitive surgery or dying screaming in pain. And the Egyptians discovered it in the most Egyptian way possible, through a lot of scientific method mixed with a considerable number of people dying by accident. Opium arrived in Egypt through Eastern Mediterranean trade routes, mainly from Cyprus and the region that is now Turkey. The plant, Papaver somniferum, didn't grow naturally in the Nile Valley, but the Egyptians quickly realized it was worth importing. Because when you're performing trepanation with bronze tools, you need something a little stronger than chamomile tea to keep the patient still. The earliest mentions of opium in medical papyri date to around 1500 BC, and from the start it's clear the Egyptians understood they were dealing with an extraordinarily potent substance. They called it the tears of Isis, a reference both to the milky sap that flows from the cut poppy and to the almost divine effects of the substance. What makes the Egyptian use of opium particularly fascinating is that they developed a sophisticated pharmacology around it before fully understanding how it worked. They knew that different doses produced different effects, that certain preparations were safer than others, and that some people were more susceptible to its deadly side effects. The Ebers Papyrus contains more than 50 recipes involving opium, ranging from mild painkillers to sedatives strong enough for major surgery. And each recipe comes with detailed instructions on dosage based on the patient's body weight, age, and general condition. This wasn't primitive medicine. It was personalized pharmacology, with a substance that could kill you if the pharmacist miscalculated. The most common application of opium was for chronic pain relief. Laborers hauling giant stones through the desert developed back problems we'd recognize today as herniated discs and severe arthritis. The standard treatment was a mixture of opium with wine and honey, taken twice daily. It was effective, but it created a dilemma that Egyptian doctors documented meticulously. Pain relief came with the risk of dependency. The papyri describe specific cases of workers who started taking opium for legitimate pain and gradually increased the doses until they became non-functional. One particularly detailed case describes a pyramid builder who, after 6 months of opium treatment for a back injury, was taking doses so high that he began hallucinating on the job and eventually fell to his death. What's impressive is that Egyptian doctors didn't simply stop prescribing opium because of these risks. Instead, they developed safety protocols. Patients on long-term opium treatment were monitored daily by trained physicians. Doses were adjusted based on specific signs of dependency, and when treatment had to be discontinued, it was done gradually with the support of other substances to minimize withdrawal symptoms. It was essentially a primitive harm reduction program. The Egyptians recognized that opium was simultaneously a medical blessing and a deadly danger, and they developed systems to maximize benefits while minimizing risks. Opium was also extensively used in surgery, and this is where things get particularly impressive from a medical history standpoint. The Egyptians performed surgical procedures that wouldn't be attempted again until the 19th century, and they did it using opium as their main anesthetic. The Edwin Smith Papyrus describes a surgery to remove a brain tumor, where the patient was given a specific preparation of opium mixed with mandrake and cannabis. The dose was calculated to keep him unconscious, but breathing throughout the procedure. The surgeon had developed a way of monitoring the depth of anesthesia by checking the patient's pupil response to light. It was primitive anesthesiology, but it worked. The papyrus records that the patient survived the surgery and made a full recovery, though it took weeks for the anesthetics to fully leave his system. But not all surgeries ended well. The same papyrus documents cases where patients died not from the surgery itself, but from anesthetic overdose. Opium had a very narrow therapeutic window between effective anesthesia and fatal respiratory depression. It was a pharmacological lottery where the difference between success and death could be a single extra drop of preparation. Egyptian doctors developed specific antidotes for opium overdose. The standard treatment was induced vomiting, followed by plant-based stimulants and manual artificial respiration. Yes, artificial respiration. They discovered that blowing air into the lungs of a person overdosed on opium could keep them alive long enough for the drug to be metabolized. Opium also had interesting obstetric applications. It was used for pain relief during difficult births, but the risks were even greater here, because the dose had to be calculated for 2 people. Too little, and the mother suffered unnecessarily. Too much, and both mother and child could die. The papyri contained specific recipes for different stages of labor. Light preparations were used during the early hours to reduce anxiety. Stronger doses were reserved for moments of extreme pain, and there were specific protocols for cases where the mother began showing signs of overdose during labor. One particularly moving entry in the Kahun Papyrus describes a woman who died of opium overdose during prolonged childbirth. The physician records his decision to increase the dose after watching her suffer for hours, and how it resulted in her death. The entry ends with a rare personal note. Sometimes mercy kills more than pain. Egyptian opium also had primitive psychiatric applications. It was used to treat what they called the madness of restless spirits, which any modern psychiatrist would recognize as severe anxiety disorders or manic episodes. Small doses were administered regularly to stabilize mood and reduce agitation. But Egyptian doctors noticed that patients treated this way for long periods developed what they called the sleeping soul, a condition where the person lost interest in normal activities, became emotionally blunted, and seemed to live in a kind of perpetual dream. It was an accurate description of the effects of chronic opiate use. The treatment for sleeping soul was interesting. Instead of simply stopping opium, doctors gradually replaced it with natural stimulants, while involving the patient in intense physical activities and forced social interaction. It was a primitive form of rehab therapy that recognized both the physical and psychological aspects of dependence. Opium also played an important role in Egypt's economy. Since the plant didn't grow locally, all opium had to be imported, creating one of history's first international drug economies. Egyptian merchants established specific trade routes to import opium, and the product became so valuable it was used as currency in some transactions. The price of opium fluctuated dramatically, depending on availability and quality. Fresh opium from Cyprus commanded premium prices, while aged or adulterated opium was significantly cheaper, but also more dangerous. Administrative papyri show that the Egyptian government sometimes stockpiled opium as a strategic reserve, both for medical use and as a trade commodity. Opium quality was strictly regulated. There were specialized inspectors who tested every imported batch, with specific standards for color, consistency, and potency. Low quality or adulterated opium was confiscated and its importers punished. It was one of the earliest quality control regulations for controlled substances. Opium also influenced Egyptian art and literature, though in subtler ways than the Blue Lotus. Medical texts often used poetic metaphors to describe opium's effects. One recipe in the Ebers Papyrus describes how opium allows the soul to visit the gods while the body rests, a clear reference to the substance's dissociative effects. Tomb paintings sometimes depict medical treatments where patients are shown in states of serene tranquility that suggest opium sedation. A famous painting in the tomb of a royal physician shows a patient undergoing surgery with a facial expression clearly that of someone under powerful analgesics. Opium also appears in religious contexts, especially in rituals related to death and the transition to the afterlife. It was used to sedate mourners during long funerals, and some evidence suggests that lethal doses of opium were occasionally used for euthanasia in cases of incurable terminal illness. This practice was controversial even then. Medical papyri contain ethical debates about when it was appropriate to use opium to hasten death versus prolong life. Some doctors argued that relieving pain was always the primary goal, regardless of the consequences. Others insisted that a physician's role was to preserve life, not end it. One particularly fascinating text describes a case where an elderly pharaoh, suffering from a painful and incurable disease, specifically requested a fatal dose of opium to end his suffering. The debate among the royal physicians over whether to grant this request lasted for days and eventually became a matter of state policy. Egyptian opium also had veterinary applications. It was used to sedate large animals during medical procedures or to relieve pain when they were injured. Veterinary papyri describe specific treatments for horses, oxen, and even sacred crocodiles, using opium preparations adjusted for different species. There were even specific recipes for different animals based on body weight and sensitivity to the drug. Horses apparently required relatively high doses, while cats were extremely sensitive and could die from amounts that barely affected humans. As Egypt was conquered by foreign powers, opium use was gradually restricted. The Persians viewed widespread opium use with suspicion, associating it with decadence and military weakness. Later, Greeks adopted some medical uses of Egyptian opium, but rejected its more experimental applications. The Roman period saw even stricter regulation. Opium became a controlled substance available only to licensed physicians and for specific military use. The detailed knowledge of preparation and dosage the Egyptians had developed was gradually lost or simplified. But traces of Egyptian opium pharmacology persisted for centuries. Medieval Arab doctors preserved some of the safer Egyptian recipes, and Byzantine medical texts reference anesthetic techniques that clearly derived from ancient Egyptian practices. The modern rediscovery of Egyptian opium. Techniques began when archaeologists found surgical instruments in tombs along with residue later identified as opium. Chemical analyses of mummies also revealed that many people had been buried with significant levels of opiates in their systems, suggesting they died under the drug's influence. The legacy of opium in ancient Egypt teaches us important lessons about pharmacology and society. The Egyptians demonstrated that it's possible to use extremely potent and dangerous substances relatively responsibly when proper systems of knowledge, training, and regulation are in place. They also showed that medical and cultural context determines whether a powerful substance is primarily beneficial or destructive. Opium in ancient Egypt was a valuable medical tool because it was used by trained professionals in carefully calculated doses for specific and legitimate purposes. But perhaps the most important lesson is that even a sophisticated civilization can underestimate the risks of powerful substances. The Egyptians lost many people to opium overdoses and dependency, despite all their science and caution. They paid a significant human price for their pharmacological advances. And with this sobering lesson about the powers and dangers of opium, the Egyptians went on to explore other substances, including a plant that would become even more central to their medicine and culture. If opium was the heavy-duty painkiller of ancient Egypt, cannabis was the pharmacological Swiss Army knife, a versatile plant that was used for everything from easing menstrual cramps to facilitating childbirth, treating glaucoma, and occasionally making those long religious ceremonies feel deeper and more meaningful than they actually were. Cannabis arrived in Egypt through trade routes from Central Asia, probably around 2000 BC. The plant Cannabis sativa found the Nile Delta a perfect environment to grow, and the Egyptians quickly discovered it had medical properties that went far beyond anything they had experienced before. What makes the Egyptian use of cannabis particularly interesting is the sophistication with which they differentiated between the various parts of the plant and their different effects. They knew that the female flowers were more potent than the leaves, that seeds had nutritional properties, and that different methods of preparation produced completely different results. The medical papyri contain more than 100 different recipes involving cannabis, from topical applications for inflammation to oral preparations for an impressive variety of conditions. And each recipe carefully specifies which part of the plant to use, how to prepare it, and exactly which symptoms it was meant for. The most common application of cannabis in Egyptian medicine was for gynecological issues. The Kahan Papyrus, dating to around 1800 BC and the earliest known medical text dedicated specifically to women's health, contains dozens of cannabis-based recipes for everything from menstrual cramps to easing difficult childbirths. Hence, one particularly detailed recipe describes cannabis. suppositories mixed with honey and other herbs for menstrual pain relief. The preparation was inserted vaginally and apparently provided significant relief without the systemic effects that could interfere with daily activities. It was essentially an early form of precision medicine, delivering the drug directly where it was needed. Cannabis was also used extensively during childbirth. Specific preparations were administered at different stages of labor to reduce pain, speed contractions, and decrease anxiety. A recipe in the Ramesseum papyrus describes a cannabis tea mixed with other herbs given to women at the start of labor to promote relaxation and reduce fear. What's impressive is that these applications make sense from a modern pharmacological standpoint. THC and other cannabinoids really do have analgesic and anxiolytic properties that would be beneficial during childbirth. The Egyptians had empirically discovered what modern science would confirm millennia later. But Egyptian cannabis wasn't limited to women's medicine. It was widely used for eye problems, including what are clearly descriptions of glaucoma. The Ebers papyrus contains recipes for cannabis, preparations applied directly to the eyes to reduce intraocular pressure and improve vision. One particularly striking recipe describes an eye drop made of cannabis mixed with honey and milk to treat blindness caused by eye pressure. The preparation was applied directly to the affected eye, and the papyrus states it often resulted in significant vision improvement. It was a surprisingly specific and effective cannabinoid medical application. Cannabis was also used for digestive problems. Oral preparations were prescribed for nausea, loss of appetite, and abdominal pain. A recipe in the Chester Beatty papyrus describes a cannabis tea mixed with mint and other digestive herbs, taken before meals to stimulate appetite and reduce nausea. This application was particularly important in a society where malnutrition and digestive issues were common due to a limited diet and poor sanitation. Cannabis provided an effective way to help sick people maintain adequate nutrition, often the difference between recovery and death. But perhaps the most fascinating Egyptian use of cannabis was in surgery. It was used both as a local anesthetic and to reduce preoperative anxiety. The Edwin Smith papyrus describes cannabis preparations mixed with oil applied to the skin before incisions to reduce pain and inflammation. Cannabis was also administered orally before surgery to calm patients and reduce the amount of opium needed for anesthesia. It was a primitive form of multimodal anesthesia that recognized different drugs, could work synergistically to improve surgical outcomes. One particularly detailed entry describes a surgery to remove a tumor where the patient received a combination of oral cannabis for anxiety, topical cannabis for local anesthesia, and a reduced dose of opium for general sedation. The patient survived the surgery and fully recovered. Remarkable for the time. Egyptian cannabis also had intriguing psychiatric applications. It was used to treat what they called spirit agitation, which included symptoms we would recognize today as anxiety, depression, and possibly bipolar disorder. Small doses were administered regularly to stabilize mood and reduce mental restlessness. Egyptian doctors noted that different cannabis preparations produced different psychological effects. Fresh cannabis tended to be more stimulating and was used for depression. Aged and fermented cannabis was more sedative and was used for anxiety and agitation. It was a sophisticated understanding of how different cannabinoids and terpenes affect the nervous system. But the Egyptians also carefully documented the risks of cannabis. Medical papyri describe cases of people developing what they called laziness of the spirits after prolonged cannabis use. It was essentially a motivational syndrome, where people lost interest in normal activities and became excessively passive. The treatment for laziness of the spirits was interesting. Instead of simply stopping cannabis, doctors gradually reduced the dose while increasing physical exercise and social responsibilities. It was a holistic rehabilitation approach that acknowledged both the physical and psychological aspects of cannabis dependence. Cannabis also played an important role in the Egyptian economy. The plant was widely cultivated along the Nile, and different regions developed specialties in specific varieties. Cannabis from Upper Egypt was considered more potent for medicinal use, while Delta cannabis was preferred for fiber and seeds. The cannabis trade was strictly regulated. There were specific standards for potency, purity, and cultivation methods. Low-quality or adulterated cannabis was confiscated and its producers punished. It was one of the first recorded quality control regulations for medicinal cannabis in history. Cannabis also influenced Egyptian art and religion in subtle but significant ways. The plant was associated with the goddess Seshat, who governed knowledge and healing. Temples dedicated to Seshat often cultivated cannabis in sacred gardens, and priests used preparations of the plant during healing rituals. Tomb paintings sometimes depict medical treatments where patients are shown in relaxed states that suggest cannabis sedation. A famous painting in the tomb of a royal physician shows a woman receiving childbirth treatment with a serene expression clearly indicative of strong. Analgesics.cannabis also appears in more direct, spiritual contexts. Some texts suggest it was used during priestly initiation ceremonies to induce altered states of consciousness that facilitated communication with deities. It was burned as incense during specific rituals, creating an atmosphere participants described as conducive to receiving divine visions. But the Egyptians were careful to distinguish between spiritual and recreational cannabis use. Ritual use was highly regulated and supervised by trained priests. Unauthorized recreational use was discouraged and sometimes punished, especially if it interfered with work responsibilities. One of the most interesting applications of Egyptian cannabis was in veterinary medicine. It was used to treat sick animals, especially horses and cattle. Veterinary papyri describe specific cannabis preparations for different species, based on body weight and drug sensitivity. Cannabis was particularly used to treat horses with respiratory problems and cattle with digestive issues. One recipe describes treating horses with breathing difficulties by making the animal inhale vapors of burning cannabis. Primitive but apparently effective respiratory veterinary medicine. Egyptian cannabis also had cosmetic applications. Cannabis oils were used in skincare preparations, especially for inflammation and irritation. Elite women often used cannabis-based creams to keep skin soft and wrinkle-free. A beauty recipe in the Edwin Smith Papyrus describes a facial cream made of cannabis mixed with honey, milk and aromatic oils, supposedly to keep skin youthful and radiant. The preparation was applied at night and left on until morning. It was essentially an early form of cannabinoid skincare. As Egypt was conquered by foreign powers, cannabis use was gradually restricted. The Persians associated cannabis with suspicious medical practices. The Greeks adopted some medical uses of Egyptian cannabis, but rejected its more experimental applications. The Roman period saw even stricter regulation. Cannabis became a controlled substance available only to licensed physicians. The detailed knowledge of cultivation and preparation the Egyptians had developed was gradually lost. or simplified. But traces of Egyptian cannabinoid medicine persisted for centuries. Medieval Arab doctors preserved some of the most effective Egyptian recipes, and Byzantine medical texts reference preparation techniques clearly derived from ancient Egyptian practices. The modern rediscovery of Egyptian medical cannabis began when archaeologists found seeds and plant remains in Egyptian tombs. Chemical analyses of mummies also revealed that many people were buried with detectable levels of THC in their systems, confirming medicinal use of the plant. Recent research using forensic techniques has revealed cannabis was far more central to Egyptian medicine than previously thought. Plant residues have been found on surgical instruments, in medicine containers, and even in mummy wrappings. The legacy of cannabis in ancient Egypt teaches us important lessons about integrative medicine. The Egyptians demonstrated how a single plant can be used for multiple medical applications when there is adequate knowledge of preparation and dosage. They also showed that intelligent regulation can allow beneficial medical use while minimizing recreational abuse. The Egyptian system of quality control and medical supervision made cannabis a valuable medical tool for over 1,000 years. But perhaps the most important lesson is that evidence-based medicine can emerge, even from ancient societies when careful observation and systematic documentation are present. The medicinal uses of cannabis developed by the Egyptians were based on rigorous empirical observation, not superstition or blind tradition. And with this solid foundation of responsible cannabinoid medicine, the Egyptians were ready to explore substances even more dangerous and controversial. If cannabis was the pharmacological Swiss army knife of ancient Egypt, mandrake was the nuclear bomb. A plant so potent and dangerous that even the Egyptians, who weren't afraid to experiment with practically anything that grew out of the ground, treated it with a mix of reverence and absolute terror. Mandragora officinarum arrived in Egypt through Eastern Mediterranean traders. And from the very first moment Egyptian physicians experimented with it, it became clear they were dealing with something completely unlike anything they had encountered before. It was a plant that could heal or kill with equal ease, depending on a dosage so precise that the difference between medicine and poison was measured in milligrams. What made mandrake particularly frightening was its unpredictability. Two roots from the same plant could have completely different potencies. The same patient could react in totally different ways to the same dose on different days. It was like playing pharmacological Russian roulette, where even experienced doctors were never sure if the patient would wake up healed or simply not wake up at all. Egyptian medical papyri contain more warnings about mandrake than about any other substance. The Ebers Papyrus devotes an entire section to the plant's dangers, including specific signs of overdose and detailed instructions on when to stop treatment before it turned fatal. It was the only drug that came with something resembling a modern prescription insert. The most common application of mandrake in Egyptian medicine was as an anesthetic for major surgeries. When opium wasn't enough, and the patient needed to be completely unconscious for hours, surgeons turned to mandrake. But it was always a last resort decision, because the mortality rate of mandrake anesthesia was frighteningly high. The Edwin Smith Papyrus describes the specific protocol for using mandrake in surgery. First, the patient was weighed and their general condition assessed. Then, a minuscule initial dose was administered to test individual sensitivity. If the patient responded well, progressively larger doses were given until they lost consciousness. If they reacted poorly to the test dose, the surgery was cancelled. It was a surprisingly sophisticated protocol that recognized individual variability in drug response. But even with all these precautions, the papyrus records a mortality rate of about 20% for surgeries using mandrake anesthesia. It was a risk Egyptians considered acceptable only for procedures impossible without deep anesthesia. One particularly detailed entry describes a surgery to remove bladder stones, where the patient was given mandrake mixed with opium and cannabis. The combination kept the patient unconscious for more than 4 hours while the surgeons worked. The patient survived, but it took 3 days to fully regain consciousness and weeks to clear the drug's effects from his system. Mandrake was also used for what Egyptians called the sleep of healing. Patients with extreme pain or severe mental illness were placed into a mandrake-induced coma for days or even weeks. The theory was that deep rest would allow the body to heal itself. In practice, it was a primitive form of coma therapy. The protocol for sleep of healing was strictly regulated. Only specially trained physicians could administer mandrake for this purpose. Patients were constantly monitored by assistants checking breathing, pulse, and body temperature. And specific antidotes were kept ready in case the patient began showing signs of fatal overdose. A recipe in the Chester Beatty Papyrus describes treating a royal scribe who had clearly developed severe depression after the death of his son. He was placed into a mandrake-induced healing sleep for 10 days. When he awoke, his symptoms had significantly improved, though it was never clear whether that was due to the drug's effects or simply the passage of time. But Egyptian mandrake had even more controversial applications. It was occasionally used for euthanasia in cases of incurable terminal illness. When a patient was suffering from extreme pain with no possibility of recovery, families could request what was euphemistically called the final sleep. This practice was highly regulated and controversial even at the time. It required approval from multiple physicians, explicit consent from the patient, and supervision by religious authorities. The process was carefully documented, and doctors who carried out mandrake euthanasia were subject to later review of their decisions. One particularly poignant case in the Kahun Papyrus describes a young woman dying of abdominal cancer. After months of extreme pain, unresponsive to any treatment, she requested final sleep. The medical debate over whether to grant her request lasted for days, and even after they agreed, it took several attempts to find the correct mandrake dose that would be quick but not agonizing. Mandrake also had psychiatric applications that were both fascinating and terrifying. It was used to treat what Egyptians called the madness of violent spirits, which included symptoms we would recognize today as schizophrenia, severe mania, and psychotic episodes. Small doses of mandrake were given to violent or delirious patients to calm them without fully sedating them. It was a thin line, because the dose required to control psychotic symptoms was dangerously close to the dose that caused coma or death. Physicians specializing in this kind of treatment were highly respected and well paid, but also had short professional life expectancies due to stress. The Ramesseum Papyrus contains a detailed account of treating a young noble who had clearly developed paranoid schizophrenia. He was convinced demons were trying to possess his body and had become violent toward family and servants. Small doses of mandrake were administered daily until his hallucinations subsided and he could function socially again. But the treatment came at a cost. The young man developed permanent tremors and partial memory loss. The papyrus notes coldly that sometimes the cure is worse than the disease, but that the family preferred a son with brain damage over one dead or perpetually violent. The Egyptians also carefully documented the effects of mandrake overdose, essentially creating the first toxicology guide for the plant. Early symptoms included dilated pupils, dry hot skin, and mental confusion. Advanced symptoms included seizures, respiratory paralysis, and eventual death. The standard antidote for mandrake overdose was induced vomiting, followed by plant-based stimulants and artificial respiration. But the papyrus notes that once advanced symptoms developed, recovery was rare. The window of time for effective intervention was measured in minutes, not hours. One particularly grim entry describes the accidental death of a young physician experimenting with mandrake dosages on himself. He had miscalculated and taken an overdose. Assistants tried every known antidote, but he died in convulsions after several hours of agony. The case became required study material for medical students on the dangers of self-experimentation. Mandrake also played an important role in Egypt's economy, but in a completely different way from other medicinal drugs. Because of its extreme danger, the mandrake trade was strictly state-controlled. Only licensed merchants could import the plant, and every batch was inspected by specialized physicians before being released for use. The price of mandrake fluctuated dramatically, not just based on availability, but also on tested quality and potency. Low-quality mandrake was useless medicinally. Overly potent mandrake was too dangerous to use. Only plants with potency within a very specific range were considered suitable for medical use. This regulation created an interesting black market. Mandrake rejected by official inspectors was often sold illegally to people who wanted it for suicide or murder. It was one of the first controlled substances to develop parallel criminal markets. Mandrake also influenced Egyptian art and literature, but in far darker ways than other medicinal drugs. The plant was associated with death and transformation. Tomb paintings sometimes show mandrake being offered to the dead as protection for the journey to the afterlife, but always with symbolism suggesting danger and terrible power. A famous painting in the tomb of a royal physician shows the process of preparing mandrake, with assistants wearing masks and gloves to avoid accidental contact with the plant. It was one of the only medicinal substances that required protective equipment for safe handling. Mandrake also appears in Egyptian magical texts, where it was used in spells related to death and resurrection. But even in magical contexts, the plant was treated with extreme caution. Sorcerers who worked with mandrake often died from accidental exposure, strengthening the association between the plant and death. As Egypt was conquered by foreign powers, mandrake use was drastically restricted. The Persians considered the plant far too dangerous for any legitimate medical use. The Greeks adopted some Egyptian protocols for surgical use, but completely rejected its psychiatric applications. The Roman period saw mandrake become a fully controlled substance, available only to military doctors specializing in battlefield medicine. The detailed knowledge of preparation and dosage the Egyptians had developed was classified as military secret and gradually lost. But traces of Egyptian mandrake pharmacology persisted in folk medical traditions for centuries. Rural healers sometimes still had access to small amounts of the plant and used it in desperate cases, though often without the technical knowledge needed for safe use. The modern rediscovery of Egyptian medicinal mandrake began when archaeologists found specialized surgical instruments in tombs along with residues later identified as mandrake alkaloids. Analysis of mummies also revealed some people had been buried with extremely high levels of atropine in their systems. Recent research using mass spectrometry revealed the Egyptians had developed purification methods that concentrated mandrake's active alkaloids, while removing some of its more toxic impurities. It was a level of pharmaceutical sophistication not matched until the 19th century. The legacy of mandrake in ancient Egypt teaches us important lessons about the limits of experimental medicine. The Egyptians showed that even extremely dangerous substances can have legitimate medical applications. When adequate knowledge and strict safety protocols are in place, they also showed that some drugs are inherently so dangerous they can never be completely safe, no matter the level of knowledge or care. Mandrake always killed a percentage of patients who received it, even when administered by experienced doctors following established protocols. But perhaps the most important lesson is that societies can make conscious decisions about acceptable medical risks. The Egyptians knew mandrake was lethal, but decided that for certain conditions the potential benefits justified the risks. It was a primitive but sophisticated form of medical risk-benefit analysis. And with this exploration of the most dangerous substance in their pharmacological arsenal, the Egyptians show us both the heights and the hazards of ancient experimental medicine. After exploring substances that could kill you with the wrong dose, let's talk about something a little more familiar, but equally important in Egyptian pharmacology: alcohol. We're not talking about happy hour at the local bar. We're talking about a society that turned beer and wine into the most sophisticated delivery systems for medicine the ancient world had ever seen. In ancient Egypt, alcohol wasn't just a social drink or a way to escape the reality of forced labor under the scorching sun. It was the foundation of an entire pharmacological system, the universal solvent that allowed Egyptian physicians to extract, concentrate, and administer practically every other psychoactive substance we've discussed so far. Egyptian beer was completely different from anything we know today. It wasn't a refreshing golden beverage you'd sip while watching a game. It was more like fermented liquid porridge, thick, nutritious, and with an alcohol content that varied wildly depending on how long it had fermented and what extra ingredients had been added. The process of making Egyptian beer was fascinating from a pharmacological perspective. It began with partially baked barley loaves soaked in water and mashed into a paste. This paste was then fermented in large jars for periods ranging from days to weeks, depending on the desired result. But here's where it gets interesting from a medical point of view. During fermentation, brewers often added other ingredients: blue lotus for relaxation, cannabis for pain relief, bitter herbs for digestive issues, honey for antibacterial properties, and sometimes even small amounts of opium for special medicinal brews. The result was a drink that was simultaneously food, medicine, and a mild psychoactive drug. It was consumed daily by virtually all Egyptians, including children, because it was safer than water and provided essential nutrition in a frequently limited diet. The medical papyri contain hundreds of recipes using beer as the base for medicines. The Ebers Papyrus describes more than 200 different preparations where beer serves as a solvent to extract the medicinal properties of plants, or as a vehicle to administer substances that would be too bitter or toxic to take pure. One particularly interesting recipe describes a medicinal beer for workers carrying heavy stones. The base beer was mixed with cannabis for pain relief, willow for anti-inflammatory properties, and blue lotus to reduce anxiety. It was consumed at the end of the workday to aid muscle recovery and improve sleep. It was essentially an ancient recovery drink, combining pain relief, anti-inflammatory action, and relaxation in one preparation. And it worked well enough that Egyptian construction workers could sustain levels of physical activity that would be impressive even by modern standards. Beer was also used extensively in Egyptian women's medicine. The Kahun papyrus contains recipes for medicinal beers tailored to different stages of pregnancy and lactation. Beer with specific herbs was prescribed for morning sickness, other brews to ease childbirth, and nutrient-rich beer for breastfeeding women. One recipe describes a beer for women in labor that contained cannabis for pain relief, blue lotus for relaxation, and various herbs thought to speed contractions. It was administered in small, regular amounts during labor to keep the mother calm but alert. But Egyptian beer also had more exotic applications. It was used as a medicinal enema for intestinal problems, as a vaginal wash for gynecological infections, and even as an eye drop when mixed with certain herbs. The Egyptians had discovered that alcohol was an excellent solvent and preservative that could extract active plant ingredients and keep them stable for long periods. Egyptian wine was considered even more medicinal than beer, partly because it was more expensive and associated with the elite, but also because the winemaking process allowed greater control over potency and purity. Grapes were fermented in sealed containers that could be monitored more carefully than the open fermentation of beer. Egyptian medicinal wines were pharmacological works of art. The process began with carefully selected grapes from regions known for producing wines with particular qualities. During fermentation, specific medicinal herbs were added at precise times to maximize the extraction of active ingredients. The Chester Beatty Papyrus describes more than 50 different types of medicinal wines, each formulated for specific conditions. Wine with opium for severe pain, wine with mandrake for surgical anesthesia, wine with blue lotus for depression, wine with cannabis for digestive problems. Each preparation came with detailed instructions on when to administer it, in what dosage, and for how long. One of the most sophisticated medicinal wines was used to treat what the Egyptians called disease of the restless soul, which clearly included symptoms of anxiety and depression. The base wine was fermented with blue lotus, small amounts of opium, honey, and a variety of aromatic herbs. The fermentation process lasted months, and the resulting wine was aged for years before being considered ready for medical use. This wine was prescribed in very small doses, taken daily over long periods. Patients reported significant mood improvement and reduced anxiety, but treatment had to be carefully monitored because the risk of dependence was high. The Egyptians also developed medicinal wines tailored to different age groups. Wines for children were sweeter and contained milder herbs. Wines for young adults were more potent and focused on issues related to heavy physical labor. Wines for the elderly were formulated for common age-related problems, such as joint pain and insomnia. A particularly interesting category was funerary wine. It wasn't meant for the dead, but for grieving families. It was formulated with herbs that eased sadness and anxiety, and served during mourning periods to help people cope with loss. It was a primitive but effective form of grief pharmacotherapy. Egyptian alcohol also played a crucial role as a preservative for other medicinal substances. Many of the psychoactive plants we've discussed lost potency quickly when dried or exposed to air, but when extracted into alcohol, their active ingredients remained stable for years. This allowed Egyptians to create pharmacies that could stock medicines for long periods without losing effectiveness. It also enabled the transport of medicines to distant regions where certain plants didn't grow naturally. It was a primitive but effective pharmaceutical distribution system. The papyri also carefully document the problems associated with excessive use of medicinal alcohol. It was recognized that patients on long-term treatment with alcoholic preparations could develop dependence. The term they used was soul imprisoned by drink, a surprisingly accurate description of alcoholism. The treatment for soul imprisoned was sophisticated for its time. It involved gradually reducing the dose of medicinal alcohol, substituting non-alcoholic preparations when possible, and intensive occupational therapy. Patients were engaged in physical activities and community projects to help restore purpose and structure to their lives. One case recorded in the Ramesseum Papyrus describes a royal scribe who developed dependence on medicinal wine after prolonged treatment for anxiety. The recovery process took months and involved the entire family. The scribe was gradually weaned off medicinal wine while learning new stress management techniques based on exercise and meditation. Egyptian alcohol also had interesting veterinary applications. It was used to treat sick animals, especially valuable horses and cattle. Specific preparations were developed for different species, taking into account differences in alcohol metabolism. One veterinary recipe describes treating a horse with colic using medicinal beer mixed with specific herbs. The horse was forced to drink the mixture through a funnel and apparently recovered within hours. It was a practical application of veterinary medicine that recognized animals could benefit from the same pharmacological preparations as humans. The regulation of Egyptian medicinal alcohol was strict. There were specific standards for potency, purity, and production methods. Brewers and winemakers producing medicinal preparations had to be licensed and were subject to regular inspections. Low quality or adulterated medicinal alcohol resulted in severe punishments. There were also regulations on who could prescribe medicinal alcohol and in what quantities. Physicians had to justify prescriptions for strong alcoholic preparations, and patients were monitored for signs of abuse. It was a primitive but effective system of substance control that recognized both the benefits and risks of alcohol. The trade in medicinal alcohol was an important part of the Egyptian economy. Special medicinal wines were exported to other Mediterranean civilizations, and Egyptian medicinal beers were famous throughout the ancient world for their quality and effectiveness. Different regions of Egypt specialized in specific types of medicinal alcohol. The Nile Delta was known for lighter beers suitable for daily use. Upper Egypt produced stronger wines for serious medicinal applications. Each region developed techniques based on local climate and available plants. As Egypt was conquered by foreign powers, many traditions of medicinal alcohol were preserved because they were seen as less controversial than other Egyptian pharmacological practices. Greeks and Romans adopted many Egyptian recipes for medicinal wines, though often simplifying the more complex formulations. The Christian period saw some resistance to medicinal alcohol due to its association with pagan rituals. But the practical usefulness of these preparations was so obvious that most continued in use. Christian monasteries often became centers of medicinal wine production, preserving Egyptian pharmacological knowledge through the Middle Ages. The modern rediscovery of Egyptian medicinal alcohol began when archaeologists found sealed amphorae in tombs that still contained residues of ancient medicinal wines. Chemical analyses revealed traces of multiple psychoactive substances that had been extracted into the alcohol. Recent research using gas chromatography has identified more than 300 different compounds in preserved samples of Egyptian medicinal alcohol. Many of these compounds are pharmacologically active, confirming the sophistication of the ancient preparations. The legacy of medicinal alcohol in ancient Egypt teaches us important lessons about drug delivery systems. The Egyptians demonstrated how a familiar substance can be transformed into a sophisticated pharmacological tool through technical knowledge and careful regulation. They also showed that social integration of psychoactive substances is possible when proper structures of knowledge and control are in place. Egyptian medicinal alcohol worked for thousands of years because it was used within an established medical system with clear protocols and professional oversight. But perhaps the most important lesson is that even substances considered relatively safe can cause significant problems when misused. The Egyptians recognized and documented the risks of alcoholism more than 3,000 years ago, developing treatments that are strikingly similar to modern approaches. And with this solid foundation of alcohol-based pharmacology, the Egyptians were ready to explore even more sophisticated applications of their substances, through methods that would turn temples into pharmacies and priests into distributors of controlled medicine. Now that we've explored how the Egyptians turned liquids into vehicles for medicine, it's time to talk about how they mastered the art of delivering drugs through the very air people breathed. The incenses and aromatic oils of ancient Egypt weren't just expensive perfumes to make temples smell nice. They were sophisticated delivery systems for psychoactive substances that turned every breath into a controlled dose of medicine. When you walk into an ancient Egyptian temple today, even after thousands of years, you can sometimes still smell faint traces of aromas clinging to the stones. That's no coincidence. These temples were essentially large-scale inhalation chambers, architecturally designed to concentrate and distribute medicinal vapors to dozens of people at once. Khifi was the king of Egyptian medicinal incenses. It wasn't a simple recipe of 1 or 2 herbs burned together. It was a complex formulation that could contain up to 16 different ingredients, each added at precise moments in the preparation process to maximize their psychoactive properties. The base recipe for Khifi included myrrh, frankincense, juniper, blue lotus, cannabis, small amounts of opium, honey, wine, raisins, and a variety of aromatic oils. But each temple developed its own variations based on specific needs and locally available plants. It was like having a personalized pharmacy that worked through the nose. The process of making Khifi was fascinating from a pharmacological perspective. It began with fermenting dried fruits and honey for several weeks. During this period, resins and specific oils were added and dissolved into the alcoholic mixture. Then dried herbs were ground into fine powder and gradually mixed in until a thick paste formed. This paste was then shaped into small balls or cones and sun-dried for days. The final product was an incense that burned slowly, releasing aromatic vapors containing the active ingredients of all the plants used in the preparation. It was a primitive but effective form of medicinal vaporization. Khifi was used in different contexts depending on the specific formulation. Light Khifi was burned during daily ceremonies to promote general well-being and tranquility. Medicinal Khifi was used during healing rituals, where patients inhaled the vapors to treat specific conditions like anxiety, insomnia, or chronic pain. Strong Chi-Fi was reserved for special occasions when altered states of consciousness were desired for communication with the gods. This type of Ki-Fi contained higher concentrations of psychoactive substances and was used only under the supervision of experienced priests. Interestingly, the Egyptians understood that different people reacted differently to the same vapors. Medical papyri describe how to adjust a patient's distance from the Chi-Fi source based on age, body weight, and individual sensitivity. It was personalized inhalation pharmacology. Beyond Chi-Fi, the Egyptians developed hundreds of other medicinal incenses for specific applications. Pure blue lotus incense for mild depression, cannabis incense for pain relief, myrrh incense for respiratory problems. Each formulation came with specific instructions on when to use it, for how long, and in what environment. One particularly interesting application was incense for childbirth. Delivery rooms were fumigated with specific mixtures of herbs believed to ease labor and reduce complications. These blends contained cannabis for pain relief, blue lotus for relaxation, and other herbs considered beneficial for mother and child. The use of medicinal incenses wasn't limited to temples and hospitals. Wealthy households often had special rooms dedicated to therapeutic inhalation. These rooms were designed with controlled ventilation that allowed vapors to concentrate without causing suffocation. Egyptian aromatic oils were equally sophisticated from a pharmacological standpoint. They weren't just plant extracts in a base oil. They were complex preparations combining multiple extraction techniques to maximize the concentration of active ingredients. The process of making Egyptian medicinal oils began with the careful selection of plants based on lunar phases and climate conditions. Different parts of plants were harvested at specific times to maximize potency. Flowers were picked at dawn, leaves at midday, roots at sunset. These plants were then processed using multiple methods: steam distillation to extract volatile oils, maceration in heated base oils to extract fat-soluble compounds, controlled fermentation to break down plant cells and release active ingredients. It was applied chemistry without molecular knowledge of chemistry. The result was oils containing very high concentrations of active ingredients. A single drop of Egyptian cannabis oil could contain the pharmacological equivalent of several grams of fresh plant. It was concentrated medicine that allowed precise dosing through topical application. Medicinal oils were applied in various ways: therapeutic massage for muscle and joint pain, application to the temples for headaches, application to the wrists for anxiety. Each site of application was chosen based on empirical observations of where different oils worked best. A particularly interesting technique was nasal application of oils. Small amounts of medicinal oil were applied inside the nostrils using special instruments. This allowed rapid absorption of active ingredients directly into the bloodstream through nasal membranes. It was a primitive form of intranasal administration. The Egyptians also developed specific medicinal oils for different age groups and health conditions: gentle oils for children and the elderly, potent oils for young, healthy adults, special oils for pregnant women considered safe during gestation. A fascinating category was oils for specific mental states: oil for courage before battles, oil for wisdom before making important decisions, oil for patience during tedious work. Each formulation was based on observations of how different plants affected behavior and cognition. The quality of Egyptian incenses and oils was strictly controlled. Specialized inspectors tested each batch of incense for potency and purity. Oils were tested by applying small amounts to volunteers and observing the effects. It was primitive, but effective pharmaceutical quality control. There were also regulations on who could produce medicinal incenses and oils. Manufacturers had to be licensed and trained in specific techniques. Recipes for potent formulations were guarded as trade secrets, passed down only to qualified apprentices. The trade in medicinal incenses and oils was an important part of the Egyptian economy. Egyptian products were exported throughout the ancient world and commanded premium prices due to their recognized quality and effectiveness. Different regions of Egypt specialized in specific types based on locally available plants. Incenses and oils also played important roles in veterinary medicine. Sick animals were treated with controlled fumigation using specific incenses. Horses with respiratory problems inhaled vapors of eucalyptus and other herbs. Cattle with infections were treated with topical application of antibacterial oils. One particularly interesting application was the use of incense for pest control. Specific mixtures were burned in barns and food storage areas to repel insects and rodents. These blends often contained plants toxic to pests, but safe for humans when inhaled in small amounts. The Egyptians also used incenses and oils for what we would now call psychological aromatherapy. Different scents were associated with different emotional states and used to induce specific mood changes. It was a primitive but effective understanding of the connection between smell and the limbic system. Patients with depression were exposed to stimulating, invigorating scents. People with anxiety inhaled calming, relaxing fragrances. Individuals with anger were treated with aromas thought to promote patience and serenity. It was psychopharmacology through smell. Incenses and oils also had applications in preparation for death and mummification. Bodies were treated with specific oils that not only preserved tissues, but were also believed to benefit the soul during its transition to the afterlife. It was medicine for the dead. As Egypt was conquered by foreign powers, many techniques for producing incenses and oils were preserved because they were seen as valuable craftsmanship rather than controversial medical practices. Greeks and Romans adopted many Egyptian formulations, though often without fully understanding their pharmacological effects. The Christian period saw some resistance to medicinal incenses due to their association with pagan rituals, but the practical usefulness of these preparations was so obvious that many continued to be used. The Coptic Church preserved many traditional recipes that were employed for legitimate medicinal purposes. The modern rediscovery of Egyptian medicinal incenses and oils began when archaeologists found distillation and incense-making equipment in tombs and temples. Chemical analyses of residues revealed traces of multiple psychoactive substances that had been concentrated through sophisticated processing techniques. Recent research using liquid chromatography has identified more than 200 pharmacologically active compounds in preserved Egyptian incense samples. Many of these compounds show significant activity on specific neurological receptors, confirming the effectiveness of the ancient preparations. The legacy of medicinal incenses and oils in ancient Egypt teaches us important lessons about alternative methods of drug administration. The Egyptians demonstrated that pharmacologically active substances can be effectively delivered through inhalation and topical absorption, not just oral ingestion. They also showed that concentration and purification can turn relatively mild plants into potent medicines. Egyptian extraction techniques created preparations far stronger than simply using fresh or dried plants. But perhaps the most important lesson is that environments can be designed to facilitate controlled drug administration. Egyptian temples were essentially architectural scale drug delivery systems that allowed simultaneous treatment of multiple people with relatively precise dosing. And with this expertise in atmospheric pharmacology, the Egyptians transformed their temples into something far more sophisticated than religious centers. They became community pharmacies where medicine and spirituality met in a synthesis that worked for thousands of years. Now that we've explored all these individual substances and methods of preparation, it's time to talk about where all of this actually happened in practice. The temples of ancient Egypt weren't just centers of religious worship. They were sophisticated pharmaceutical complexes that combined production, distribution, and administration of medicines on a scale that would make a modern pharmacy chain look amateur. When you walk through the ruins of a great Egyptian temple today, you're looking at the remains of an industrial pharmaceutical operation. These complexes had botanical gardens for cultivating medicinal plants, laboratories for processing substances, storage rooms for stocking medicines, and clinics where treatments were administered under the supervision of priest-physicians. The Temple of Komombo, dedicated to the gods Sobek and Horus, had one of the most sophisticated pharmaceutical operations of the ancient world. Archaeologists have found evidence of specialized gardens where more than 100 different medicinal plants were cultivated. There were separate sections for plants requiring specific growing conditions, primitive greenhouses for tropical species, and even controlled irrigation systems. But it wasn't just agriculture. The temple had processing facilities that included special ovens for drying plants, presses for extracting oils, distilleries for producing concentrated essences, and fermentation rooms for preparing alcohol-based medicines. It was a pharmaceutical factory that operated continuously for centuries. Most impressively, each temple specialized in specific types of medicine, based on the deities they worshipped and the most common health conditions in their region. Temples dedicated to Isis often specialized in women's and obstetric medicine. Temples of Thoth focused on mental and neurological medicine. Temples of Sekhmet were known for treatments of infectious diseases and surgery. This specialization wasn't accidental. It was the result of centuries of empirical observation and the development of expertise. Priest-physicians dedicated their entire lives to studying specific conditions and developing treatments. It was a primitive but effective form of medical specialization. The Temple of Dendera, dedicated to the goddess Hathor, developed an international reputation for psychiatric treatments using complex combinations of psychoactive substances. Patients traveled from across the Mediterranean world to receive treatment for what we would now recognize as depression, anxiety, and psychotic disorders. Treatments at Dendera involved protocols lasting weeks or months. Patients were housed in the temple complex while receiving carefully calibrated doses of blue lotus, cannabis, and other substances. The process included not only medication, but also occupational therapy, exercise, music, and structured social support. It was a primitive form of psychiatric hospital that recognized that effective treatment of mental health required more than just drugs. The therapeutic environment, social structure, and emotional support were considered as important as the pharmacological substances. Temple records show impressive rates of improvement. About 70% of patients showed significant progress after completing treatment. That was a success rate that would be respectable even by modern standards, especially considering they were treating conditions that often didn't respond to other available treatments at the time. The temple's pharmaceutical distribution system was equally sophisticated. There was a network of smaller temples and shrines that served as distribution points for rural communities. Medicines were produced in the major temple complexes and distributed through this network to ensure that even remote populations had access to basic treatments. This distribution was carefully regulated. Each priest-physician was authorized to prescribe only certain categories of medicines depending on their level of training and experience. More dangerous substances like opium and mandrake could only be prescribed by senior physicians with years of specific expertise. The Temple of Edfu operated what was essentially a pharmacological medical school. Young aspiring doctors spent years learning medical botany, plant chemistry, dosage calculation, and diagnosis. The curriculum included not just theory, but also supervised practical experience treating real patients. Students began by learning to identify and cultivate medicinal plants. Then they progressed to processing and preparation techniques. Eventually, they were authorized to administer treatments under direct supervision. Only after years of training and proven competence were they considered qualified for independent practice. It was a medical education system that ensured consistent standards of care and minimized dangerous errors. The rate of pharmacological accidents in temples with rigorous training programs was significantly lower than in places where doctors were self-taught. The temples also maintained extensive medical libraries that functioned as pharmacological databases. Medical papyri were copied and distributed among temples to ensure that knowledge of new treatments spread quickly. There was a primitive, but effective system of medical communication among different treatment centers. When a temple developed a new effective treatment, the recipe was carefully documented and sent to other temples for testing and validation. If multiple temples confirmed its effectiveness, the treatment was incorporated into the standard medical corpus. It was a primitive form of peer review that ensured only genuinely effective treatments were widely adopted. The economic aspect of temple pharmacies was fascinating. They operated as profitable enterprises that sustained not only medical activities, but also the entire religious infrastructure. Patients paid for treatments according to their financial capacity, with the wealthy paying premium prices and the poor receiving free or discounted care. This cross-subsidy pricing structure allowed temples to provide universal care while remaining financially viable. It was a primitive but effective model of public health care that guaranteed access based on medical need rather than just ability to pay. Temples also generated revenue through medical training, export of medicines, and consulting for other medical centers. Egyptian temple physicians were often hired by foreign governments to establish similar medical systems in their own civilizations. Quality and safety were strictly controlled through systems of inspection and audit. Government authorities made regular visits to check production conditions, medicine quality, and physician competence. Temples that didn't meet standards lost their licenses to operate or were forced to implement corrections. There were also systems for reporting adverse events. When patients suffered unexpected or dangerous reactions to treatments, cases were documented and investigated. If a pattern of problems emerged with a specific medicine, its use was restricted or banned until issues were resolved. It was a primitive but effective system of pharmacovigilance that allowed for rapid identification of dangerous treatments and implementation of safety measures. The mortality rate from medical treatments in Egyptian temples was surprisingly low given the potency of the substances used. Temples also functioned as research centers, constantly developing new treatments and improving existing ones. Temple physicians conducted what were essentially clinical trials, testing new substances and combinations on small groups of volunteer patients before broader adoption. This research was carefully documented in papyri that served both as medical records and as scientific literature. Many of the medical papyri that survive today are essentially research reports describing methodology, results, and conclusions of ancient pharmacological studies. The Temple of Saqqara pioneered what we would now call evidence-based medicine. They kept detailed records of all treatments administered and their outcomes, allowing statistical analysis of the effectiveness of different therapeutic approaches. These records revealed interesting patterns. Treatments combining multiple substances often produced better results than monotherapy. Patients who received structured social support during treatment recovered faster. Certain drug combinations were particularly effective for specific conditions. It was a rigorous scientific approach that allowed continuous optimization of treatment protocols based on empirical evidence, rather than tradition or blind superstition. Temples also served as centers of preventive medicine. Public health campaigns were organized during religious festivals when large crowds gathered. Temple physicians used these occasions to educate people about hygiene, nutrition, and disease prevention. Primitive vaccines were administered during these events. Although the Egyptians didn't understand immunology, they observed that controlled exposure to certain diseases could prevent more severe infections later. It was a rudimentary form of inoculation that predated modern vaccination techniques by millennia. As Egypt was conquered by foreign powers, many temple pharmacies continued to operate because they provided essential medical services that new governments couldn't easily replace. Greeks and Romans often preserved existing Egyptian medical systems while gradually introducing their own practices. The Christian period saw many temple pharmacies transformed into Christian hospitals that preserved much Egyptian medical knowledge, while adapting practices to conform to Christian doctrines. Many Egyptian pharmacological techniques survived through this transition and influenced the development of medieval medicine. The modern rediscovery of Egyptian temple pharmacies began when archaeologists found pharmaceutical processing equipment and large quantities of preserved medicinal plants in temple complexes. Analyses revealed evidence of industrial-scale pharmaceutical operations that had functioned for centuries. The legacy of Egyptian temple pharmacies teaches us important lessons about the integration of healthcare. They demonstrated how medicine, education, research, and social services can be combined within a single institution to maximize effectiveness and efficiency. They also showed that sustainable healthcare systems require diversified revenue and cross-subsidies to guarantee universal access. The Egyptian financing model allowed for high-quality care across all socioeconomic levels through intelligent pricing structures, but perhaps the most important lesson is that effective medicine requires more than just pharmacological knowledge. The Egyptian temples recognized that therapeutic environment, social support, patient education, and holistic care were as important as specific drugs in achieving optimal health outcomes. Now that we understand how the entire Egyptian pharmacological system worked, it's time to talk about its most privileged and best documented users, the pharaohs themselves. Because if you thought ruling an empire in the ancient world was stressful, imagine doing it while being considered a living god. held responsible for the behavior of the Nile River, and expected to make decisions affecting millions of people. Of course, they needed chemical help. Pharaohs had access to what was essentially the first personalized medicine program in history. Royal physicians developed specific formulations based on each ruler's personality, stress levels, and health needs. It was custom-tailored pharmacology for people who literally could not afford to have a bad day. Tutankhamun is probably the most well-documented pharaoh from a pharmacological perspective, not because he was particularly important historically, but because his tomb was discovered intact with his entire chemical survival kit preserved. And what a kit it was! Archaeologists found more psychoactive substances in Tut's tomb than in many modern pharmacies. The inventory included cannabis oils, opium resin, blue lotus prepared in various ways, special incenses, and a variety of substances we still haven't fully identified. This wasn't stock for the afterlife. It was the personal medicine cabinet of a teenager who ruled an empire and apparently needed substantial pharmacological assistance to cope with the pressure.chemical analysis of Tutankhamun's mummy revealed detectable levels of THC, opiates, and other psychoactive compounds in his tissues. He died under the influence of multiple substances, which initially led researchers to speculate about accidental overdose. But later evidence suggested it was more likely medical treatment for a terminal illness. Tut had multiple health problems, including malaria, bone fractures, and what was likely a systemic infection. His physicians appear to have been administering a cocktail of painkillers and sedatives to make his final days more bearable. It was primitive palliative care, using the best drugs available at the time. Ramses II, one of the longest-lived and most successful pharaohs, had a completely different approach to pharmacological substances. Instead of using them to treat health problems, he saw them as performance tools that helped him maintain energy and focus. During his 66-year reign, medical texts describe specific formulations developed for Ramses that combined natural stimulants with primitive nootropics, preparations that enhanced memory, increased physical energy, and maintained mental clarity during long governance sessions. It was cognitive doping for pharaohs. One particularly interesting recipe describes a morning tonic Ramses drank daily, made of cannabis in small doses to reduce anxiety, plant-based stimulants for energy, and substances that improved cerebral circulation. It was essentially a psychoactive multivitamin designed specifically for the demands of ruling an empire. Hatshepsut, one of the few female pharaohs, faced unique challenges that required creative pharmacological solutions. As a woman in a traditionally male role, she needed to project authority and confidence while navigating intense political pressures. Her physicians developed preparations that helped her maintain composure in stressful situations. Medical papyri described treatments for Hatshepsut that included natural adaptogens for stress resistance, mood-modulating substances to prevent emotional swings, and preparations that improved vocal quality for public speeches. It was political pharmacology in action. Hatshepsut also used cosmetic substances with psychoactive properties, makeup containing mild stimulants to keep her alert during long ceremonies, perfumes with aromatherapeutic compounds to promote calm, and topical preparations with pain-relieving properties to cope with the physical strain of heavy ceremonial garments. Akhenaten, the revolutionary pharaoh who temporarily shifted Egyptian religion toward monotheism, had a particularly interesting relationship with psychoactive substances. Some modern theories suggest that his radical religious visions may have been influenced by the use of hallucinogens, although direct evidence is limited. What we do know is that Akhenaten used pharmacological preparations for what his doctors described as the illness of restless spirits. It was probably some form of mental disorder that required regular medication. Preparations included mood stabilizers and mild sedatives. Akhenaten also experimented with ritual use of psychoactive substances as part of his religious reforms. Ceremonies dedicated to the god Aten included special incenses and preparations that supposedly facilitated direct communication with the deity. It was a primitive form of psychedelic theology. Cleopatra's Sekhvin, the last pharaoh of Egypt, had access to what was possibly the most sophisticated pharmacological arsenal of the ancient world. As ruler of a Hellenistic Egypt that had absorbed Greek and Roman medical knowledge, she had access to substances and techniques from across the Mediterranean. Cleopatra extensively used pharmacological cosmetics, makeup containing psychoactive substances to enhance appearance and mood, perfumes with pheromones and stimulants, and preparations that altered pupil size for specific visual effects. It was chemistry applied to political seduction. She was also known to use substances as diplomatic tools. Political banquets included wines and foods containing substances that promoted goodwill, reduced suspicion, and facilitated negotiations. It was chemical diplomacy on a scale that would make a modern lobbyist blush. Cleopatra reportedly experimented with poisons and antidotes as protection against assassination, taking small doses of toxic substances to build resistance. It was a dangerous practice, but understandable given her political risks. The pharaoh's use of substances wasn't limited to personal benefit. It was often a matter of national security. Rulers who couldn't maintain adequate cognitive and physical performance were vulnerable to coups or invasions. Pharmacology was literally a matter of political survival. Royal physicians developed specific protocols for different crises pharaohs might face. Emergency preparations for battle that boosted courage and pain resistance. Formulations for diplomatic crises that improved negotiation skills and emotional control. There were also specific preparations for ceremonial events where pharaohs had to maintain composure during hours-long rituals. Substances that prevented fatigue, maintained focus, and enhanced physical presence were administered before important occasions. Dosing for pharaohs was extremely precise. Royal physicians kept detailed records of how different substances affected each ruler, adjusting formulations based on individual reactions. It was personalized pharmacology at the highest level. Safety protocols were equally strict. All substances were tested by tasters before being administered to the pharaoh. Specific antidotes were kept on hand in case something went wrong, and multiple physicians had to agree before any new substance was tried. The most fascinating aspect of royal pharmacology was how it was integrated into daily governance. Meetings of the royal council were scheduled for times when the pharaoh was under the influence of substances that improved decision-making. Public audiences were timed to coincide with preparations that boosted charisma and presence. It was a system where personal chemistry determined state policy. Decisions affecting millions were often made by rulers carefully calibrated with psychoactive substances. The pharmacological costs of maintaining a pharaoh were astronomical. Some substances were imported from distant lands at prices that could feed entire villages. Personalized preparations required rare ingredients more valuable than gold. It was literally investing national wealth in the ruler's personal chemistry. But Egyptians considered it a necessary expense. A pharaoh functioning at reduced capacity could make poor decisions that cost far more than any medicine. It was cost-benefit analysis applied to political pharmacology. Royal succession created unique pharmacological problems. New pharaohs had to be gradually adapted to the substances considered necessary for effective governance. It was a process of chemical conditioning that could take months or years. Some princes developed tolerances or sensitivities that made them unsuitable for certain essential substances. This could effectively disqualify them from succession, creating pharmacological criteria for political leadership. Older pharaohs often developed dependencies that complicated transitions of power. Preparations that kept them functional also made them incapable of ruling without continuous chemical assistance. It was a dilemma balancing governmental effectiveness against personal health. When pharaohs died, their pharmacological preparations often died with them. Specific recipes were burned to prevent use by would-be usurpers. It was security through destruction of pharmacological knowledge. Archaeological evidence suggests several pharaohs died from substance-related complications, accidental overdoses, dangerous drug interactions, and cumulative effects of prolonged use were occupational hazards of being a god-king. But even with these risks, the practice continued for millennia, because the benefits were considered essential. Pharaohs who tried to rule without pharmacological assistance often proved less effective than those who embraced. The medical system available, the pharmacological legacy of the Egyptian pharaohs, teaches us important lessons about power and substances. It shows how privileged access to drugs can become both a tool and a prison for political leaders. It also shows that enhanced cognitive and emotional performance through substances can have genuine social benefits when responsibly applied by people in positions of great responsibility. But perhaps the most important lesson is that even the most sophisticated pharmacological systems carry inherent risks that must be balanced against potential benefits. The Egyptian pharaohs paid significant personal prices for their chemically enhanced performance. If you thought the use of psychoactive substances in ancient Egypt ended with death, you completely underestimated the Egyptian ability to turn any aspect of human existence into a pharmacological opportunity. Death was not the end of the chemical journey. It was only the beginning of an even more elaborate and expensive phase. The Egyptians developed an entire pharmacological system dedicated exclusively to death, mummification, and preparation for the afterlife. It was as if they had created a pharmaceutical industry specialized in clients who could no longer complain if something went wrong. The mummification process itself was a complex chemical operation involving multiple psychoactive substances, not only to preserve the body, but to ensure the soul would have access to all the drugs it had used in life during its journey into eternity. It was a post-mortem pharmacological insurance policy, starting with the obvious: anesthesia for the living during funerary rituals. Egyptian funerals could last weeks, involving professional mourners, elaborate processions, and ceremonies that pushed human emotional endurance to the limit. Bereaved families were given specific preparations to help them survive the ordeal. The Papyrus of Eni, part of the famous Book of the Dead, contains recipes for what was called medicine of mourning. Preparations based on blue lotus to reduce extreme grief, cannabis for emotional pain relief, and small amounts of opium for cases where anguish became physically unbearable. It was pharmacological therapy for grief that recognized extreme loss as both a medical and emotional problem. Widows who stopped eating, parents who developed physical pain after losing children, children rendered non-functional after the death of parents, all were treated with specific medicines. One particularly detailed recipe, describes the treatment of a mother who entered a catatonic state after the death of her only son. She was medicated with a careful combination of mild stimulants and natural antidepressants until she could participate in the funeral. It was an emergency pharmacological intervention for psychological trauma. But the most fascinating aspects of Egyptian mortuary pharmacology involved the mummification process itself. Embalmers were not just preservation technicians. They were specialized chemists who used psychoactive substances as an integral part of preparing the body. During the removal of internal organs, small amounts of cannabis and opium were applied to the body cavities. Officially, this was for antibacterial and preservative properties. In practice, it was to ensure residues of these substances remained in the mummified body, allowing the soul to continue accessing them in the afterlife. It was like packing the body with drugs for the trip. Egyptians believed the soul retained some connection to the physical body, and substances present in the mummified remains could be accessed spiritually when needed. It was interdimensional pharmacology. The desiccation process also involved psychoactive substances. Natron, the salt used to dry bodies, was often mixed with resins containing active compounds. Myrrh and frankincense weren't just for fragrance. They contained substances absorbed by tissues during drying. Modern analysis of mummies has revealed many contained detectable levels of THC, opiates, and other psychoactive compounds not only in the organs but distributed throughout tissues. It was systematic pharmacological preservation, ensuring the entire body became a reservoir of substances for post-mortem use. The wrappings used in mummification were often soaked in oils containing drugs. Each layer of linen was treated with specific preparations before being applied to the body. It was like creating a long-release medication system designed to function for millennia. One mummy discovered at Saqqara had bandages containing more than 15 different psychoactive substances. Each layer had been treated with a different preparation, creating a concentration gradient, theoretically allowing the soul to access different types of pharmacological effects as needed. Organs removed during mummification received special pharmacological treatment. They were preserved in canopic jars containing not only natron, but also complex mixtures designed to keep their psychoactive properties active indefinitely. The liver, considered the center of emotions, was preserved with mood-modulating substances. The lungs were treated with preparations supposedly maintaining the capacity to breathe pharmacological vapors. It was organ preservation with a pharmacological orientation. But Egyptian mortuary pharmacology went far beyond mummification. Objects buried with the dead included elaborate stores of substances for afterlife use. These weren't just symbolic. They were portable pharmacies designed to last eternity. Tutankhamun was buried with more than 200 different pharmacological preparations. Oils, incenses, resins, powders, and mixtures, covering virtually every known medical application of the time. It was like being buried with a complete pharmacy in case you felt unwell in eternity. These preparations were not chosen randomly. They were based on the health conditions the pharaoh had faced in life, the substances he had regularly used, and the difficulties he was expected to encounter on his journey through the underworld. It was pharmacological planning for posthumous adventures. Lesser nobles were buried with simpler but still substantial kits. One scribe was buried with preparations for headaches, digestive issues, and anxiety. It was like a basic travel pharmacy for the afterlife. Even common people were often buried with at least a few pharmacological items. Dried blue lotus, small amounts of cannabis, basic aromatic oils. These were considered as essential as food or clothing for the post-mortem journey. Funerary texts contained specific instructions on how to use these substances in the afterlife. The Book of the Dead includes recipes for preparing medicines using ingredients available in the underworld. It was a pharmacological manual for the dead. One particularly interesting section describes how to use underworld blue lotus to ease anxiety during the judgment of the soul. Another explains how to prepare painkillers using plants growing in the reed fields of the afterlife. It was speculative pharmacology based on imaginary geography. The funerary rituals themselves involved extensive use of psychoactive substances by the living participants. Priests conducting ceremonies were often under the influence of preparations supposedly facilitating communication with the dead. During the opening of the mouth ritual, where the mummy was symbolically reanimated, priests inhaled specific incenses that put them into altered states of consciousness. It was considered necessary to establish spiritual connection with the deceased soul. Professional mourners, women hired to publicly display grief, used preparations that intensified emotional responses, substances that made tears flow more easily, amplified expressions of sorrow, and made lamentations more convincing. It was pharmacologically enhanced acting. Funerary. Banquets included foods and drinks containing psychoactive substances, not only for the mourner's comfort but also to facilitate communication with the spirit of the deceased during the meal. It was chemically assisted dining with the dead. One description of a noble's funerary banquet mentions wine mixed with substances that allowed participants to see and hear the dead during the meal. It was guided hallucination for emotional closure. Egyptian cemeteries were designed to facilitate continuous use of substances by the living visiting the dead. Larger tombs had special rooms where families could burn incense and inhale medicinal vapors while communicating with deceased relatives. These rooms were equipped with ventilation systems that concentrated pharmacological vapors. It was architecture designed to optimize psychedelic experiences in funerary settings. Annual festivals for visiting the dead involved communal use of psychoactive substances. Entire families consumed preparations, supposedly facilitating spiritual visits to deceased relatives. It was cemetery psychedelic tourism. The Wag Festival, dedicated to the dead, was essentially a mass pharmacological event, where entire communities used substances to connect with ancestors. It was like a music festival, but with the dead. The economy of mortuary pharmacology was impressive. Properly preparing a noble's mummy with all necessary drugs for the afterlife could cost more than keeping a person alive for years. It was literally investing a fortune in drugs for the dead. But Egyptians considered it essential. A soul poorly prepared pharmacologically could face unnecessary suffering in the afterlife, fail divine judgments, or even become a restless spirit, causing trouble for the living. The trade in funerary substances created an entire industry. Specialized embalmers, cultivators of plants specifically for mortuary use, chemists developing long-term preservation preparations. It was an economic sector based entirely on drugs for the dead. After exploring 3,000 years of Egyptian chemical experimentation, one thing becomes crystal clear. The ancient Egyptians were not reckless drug users who just happened to build one of the greatest civilizations in history. They were meticulous scientists who understood something we are still trying to relearn: that psychoactive substances, when used with knowledge, supervision, and respect, can be powerful tools to improve the human experience. The Egyptian pharmacological legacy spread far beyond the banks of the Nile. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BC, his physicians were fascinated by the sophistication of Egyptian medicine. Many techniques and substances were quickly absorbed into Greek and later Roman pharmacology. Hippocrates, the father of modern medicine, visited Egypt and studied with Egyptian doctors. Many of the treatments he later codified derived directly from Egyptian pharmacological practices. The Hippocratic Oath to do no harm reflects the Egyptian medical ethic on responsible use of powerful substances. Galen, the Roman physician whose theories dominated European medicine for over 1,000 years, based many of his treatments on Egyptian pharmacology. His prescriptions for mental disorders, pain relief, and surgical anesthesia were direct adaptations of methods developed in Egyptian temples centuries earlier. The medical school of Alexandria preserved Egyptian pharmacological knowledge throughout the Roman and Byzantine periods. Greek and Latin medical texts contain hundreds of references to Egyptian medicines, preparation techniques, and administration methods. It was international-scale technology transfer. When Islam spread into Egypt in the 7th century, Arab physicians eagerly absorbed the local pharmacological knowledge. Many of the extraction, purification, and preparation techniques that characterize the golden age of Islamic medicine derived directly from ancient Egyptian practices. Avicenna, the great Persian physician, included hundreds of Egyptian medicines in his Canon of Medicine, which became the standard medical text in medieval Europe. Through this book, Egyptian pharmacological knowledge influenced European medicine well into the Renaissance. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Egyptians is not specific substances or preparation techniques. It is the overall approach they developed for integrating psychoactive substances into society in a functional and relatively safe way. The Egyptians understood that context was everything. The same substance that could be beneficial when used medicinally under supervision could be destructive when used recreationally without knowledge. They developed systems that maximized benefits while minimizing harm. Smart regulation was central to Egyptian success. Instead of banning dangerous substances, they controlled who could use them, under what circumstances, and with what supervision. It was a harm reduction approach that recognized both utility and risks. Education was equally important. Egyptian physicians spent years learning pharmacology before being authorized to prescribe potent substances. Users were educated on effects, risks, and warning signs. It was pharmacological literacy as public health policy. Social integration allowed psychoactive substances to function as constructive tools rather than destructive problems. When drug use is isolated and stigmatized, it tends to become problematic. When integrated into functional social structures, it can be beneficial. The Egyptian approach also emphasized purpose over pleasure. Substances were used to achieve specific goals: healing illness, facilitating rituals, improving performance. Purely hedonistic use was discouraged because it often led to problems. But the Egyptians also teach us about the limits of even the best systems. Despite their sophistication, they still lost many people to overdoses, dependence, and unexpected side effects. Even with advanced knowledge and careful precautions, powerful substances always carry inherent risks. What can we learn from the Egyptian experience to apply to today's challenges with psychoactive substances? Several lessons are obvious. Education is preferable to ignorance. Smart regulation works better than absolute prohibition. Medical supervision reduces risks. Social integration is safer than marginalization. But perhaps the most important lesson is that societies can make conscious choices about how to approach psychoactive substances. The Egyptians chose to embrace them as useful tools requiring respect and care. That choice allowed them to develop one of the most sophisticated pharmacologies of the ancient world. Modern societies face similar choices. We can continue treating all psychoactive substances as equally dangerous and prohibit them through criminalization. Or we can learn from the Egyptians and develop systems that allow beneficial use while minimizing harm. The historical evidence suggests Egyptian approaches were more effective than modern prohibitionist policies. They maintained functional substance use within their society for 3,000 years. Many modern societies are struggling with drug problems after only decades of prohibition. This does not mean we should simply copy Egyptian methods. We live in different societies, with different technologies and superior scientific knowledge. But we can learn general principles about how human societies can integrate powerful substances in ways that maximize benefits and minimize harm. Egyptian pharmacological knowledge also reminds us that modern medicine has lost some valuable approaches. Our tendency to focus on single synthetic drugs sometimes makes us forget that natural plants often contain complex mixtures of compounds that work synergistically. Modern integrative medicine is rediscovering principles the Egyptians intuitively understood, that effective treatment often requires holistic approaches, addressing not just physical symptoms, but also psychological, social, and spiritual aspects of illness. The Egyptian emphasis on personalized medicine also anticipated modern trends. They understood that different people respond differently to the same substances and developed protocols to adjust treatments based on individual characteristics. Their systems of pharmacovigilance, though primitive by modern standards, recognized the importance of monitoring adverse effects and adjusting practices based on empirical evidence. It was a scientific approach valuing observation over blind tradition. Perhaps the most impressive aspect of Egyptian pharmacology was its longevity. Systems that worked for 3,000 years clearly incorporated enduring principles about human nature and how societies can responsibly manage powerful substances. The ancient Egyptians left us more than pyramids and mummies. They left us a functional model of how civilizations can embrace the power of psychoactive substances without being destroyed by them. It was a synthesis of scientific knowledge, medical supervision, smart regulation, and social integration that allowed drugs to serve humanity instead of dominate it. In our modern age, as we wrestle with questions of legalization, medical regulation, and harm reduction policies, perhaps we should look back to the Nile for inspiration. Not to copy ancient solutions, but to learn enduring principles about how human societies can live in harmony with the powerful substances nature provides. The Egyptians showed us it is possible. For 3,000 years, they proved that psychoactive substances can be allies of civilization rather than enemies. Now it is up to us to decide whether we are wise enough to learn from their experience.